Welcome to Economists forum presentation. Our team will be presenting Daly Herman's paper on the economic growth debate, what some economists have learned, but many have not. So before we go into the material, I just want to introduce everyone on the team. So I'm Vanessa, and I'll be presenting with my two other teammates, Kat and Nick. Now, let's first look at two concepts, growth and development. So growth is the quantitative increase in the scale of physical dimensions of the economy, while development is the qualitative improvement in structure, design, and composition of physical stocks and flows that result from greater knowledge both of technique and of purpose. So in short, growth is the quantitative improvement in physical dimensions, and development is the qualitative improvement in non-physical characteristics. It's clear that the economy has developed without growing, just as the planet Earth has developed without growing. But this leads into the main discussion we'll be presenting today, that there are two general cases of limits to growth. One is the biophysical limit, and the other is ethicosocial limit. And in both cases, it is growth, not development, that is limited. So standard neoclassical economics was built on the assumption that the economy is far from those limits, like that is always biophysically possible and ethicosocially desirable for aggregate product to grow. However, this practical judgment ceases to be true as the economy approaches either or both limits. The gain in economic welfare could easily be more than offset by a loss of natural ecosystem services. Frankly, a more general theory is needed to embrace both normal and limiting cases. And this is particularly important in economics because economic growth means that the close to the limit cases more and more becomes the norm. And the nearer we are to the limit, the less we could assume that economic welfare and total welfare move in the same direction. So to accommodate this evolved environment, we must learn to define and explicitly account for the other sources of welfare that growth inhibits and erodes when it presses against the limit. Now I'll pass down to my colleagues to discuss the two categories of limited growth in detail.
I will be discussing the biophysical limitations to economic growth. So there are three fundamental concepts that form the basis of these biophysical limitations, and those concepts are finitude, entropy, and ecological interdependence. So entropy is a very important concept to understanding these biophysical limitations, and entropy refers to the amount of energy that is unavailable to do work. Related to this is entropy law. And entropy law states that with every energy-based transformation, a system loses part of its ability to perform work. In the context of this paper, this refers to that in the process of production, from taking a raw material and turning it into a finished good ready for consumption, there is energy that is used and made unavailable for further reuse and recycling of this good. So the first category of biophysical limitations is spatial limits. So the economy is a subsystem within the larger ecosystem. And in this larger ecosystem, we have our supply of raw materials and our sinks for waste. And the growth of this economic subsystem is limited by the size of the overall system. And this is because the supply of raw materials is a finite resource, and as is the available space to store waste. So these two concepts of entropy and finitude are incredibly interdependent in the sense that finitude would not be so limiting of a concept if everything could be recycled, but entropy and this unavailable energy prevents this constant cycle of recycling. And entropy would not be so limiting of a concept if sources of raw materials and sinks for waste were infinite in space, but however, they are spatially finite. The combination of both these effects creates disorder in the form of depletion and pollution and imposes this on our terrestrial ecosystem. And this interrupts the intricate ecological connections which are found in the ecosystem and many of which support life on Earth, including human life. So this chart here describes the flow of matter energy within the ecosystem. So at the top here, we have our raw materials, and these raw materials are low entropy types of matter, meaning that they can be easily rearranged into a different form, which is why we take our raw materials and turn them into finished goods within our economy. And at the other end of this chart, we have waste, which is a high entropy source of matter, meaning that it cannot be easily rearranged into a different form, which is why we are forced to simply store a lot of our waste as pollution within the ecosystem. And this is a linear one direction entropic flow, which meaning that at one end we're always going to have depletion of our resources, and at the other end we are always going to have an overabundance of pollution. So the second category of biophysical limitations is temporal limits. So there are three entropic timeframes to consider in this temporal limits. The first time frame is the long run, and this time frame is largely irrelevant to the discussion of biophysical limitations because it is occurring in the few billion years type of realm, and it's when we see the final heat death and we run out of solar energy. The second time frame is the medium run, and this time frame refers to about 25 to 75 years or one average lifetime. And in this time frame, we expect to see essentially no change in our low entropy solar energy. However, we could expect to see significant depletion of our terrestrial sources of low entropy resources. So this time frame is the most important for considering in the discussion of biophysical limitations because our economic and industrial growth is limited by the stock of available terrestrial low entropy resources. And the last time frame is the short run. And the short run is more of the moment-to-moment concept, and it refers more to the differentiation between raw materials and waste and the journey of production throughout that. So it's referring more specifically to the chart a couple of slides ago. And this is still relevant to the consideration of biophysical limitations, however, not as important as the medium run. So another consideration in the discussion of temporal limits is that time is a finite resource. So every part of the production process takes time, the production, consumption, recycling, dealing with waste, etc. And time is a finite resource, and we are finding that the time dimension is becoming increasingly congested, similar to the congestion we see in our spatial dimension. And this is due to, with increased productivity, the relative price of time is increasing in terms of goods is increasing. And in response to this, we try to raise the marginal return of non-work time to reflect this increase. But the result is simply a greater congestion of the time dimension. So the last part of this discussion of biophysical limits is whether we are approaching these limits. And part of the discussion that was in this paper is slightly outdated because the paper was written about 40 years ago. But a lot of the things it states still stand true today, just on a slightly different timeline. So our world population is growing. Many have said that when the population reaches 10 billion, that will be the maximum carrying capacity of our Earth, and we are expected to reach that by, the paper states 2030, it's closer to 2050 now. We're seeing increasing numbers of species are becoming endangered and extinct, and this is interrupting the life-supporting function of our ecosystem. And the paper states that production of basic renewable resource systems have all peaked and begun to decline. This is in reference to sources of raw material becoming more depleted.
Ethicosocial limits. The desirability of growth financed by drawdown is limited by the costs imposed on future generations. The basic needs of the present should always take precedence over the needs of the future, because without the current generation's basic needs being met, there will not be any future generations. However, the cost we impose on the future through our desire for growth presents a moral obligation to future generations. Economics has managed to take the moral aspect out of it by representing preferences weighted by individuals' income and expenditure. The problem here is that future generations' incomes are not represented in this model, and therefore cannot have their preferences accounted for. Two interpretations which derive a solution to this problem are through an individualistic approach and a social approach. The former, referred to as selfish altruism, accounts for the interests of the future to be reflected through a present value formula, where the costs and benefits to future generations are discounted. From this approach, we see that we are willing to make sacrifices, but at a discount, since the contemplated welfare of the future matters less than the present. The latter approach, referred to as disinterested fairness, offers a model that puts the present generation in the future's place to restrain consumption. In this model, the individual does not know which generation they are from, creating a veil of ignorance, where the objective value of fairness is met. The social approach experiences drawdown and limited growth through the concept of fairness, whereas the individualistic approach does so according to the subjective preferences of the present generation. Limits to takeover. Both subhuman species and economic growth require space. Economic growth requires space for increasing stocks, sourcing raw materials, population, and sinks for waste materials, as opposed to subhuman species who require space for reproduction, habitats, and life-supporting systems. For this reason, we see a limit to growth by extinction and reduction in the number of subhuman species from the takeover of their habitats. In addition to this, it is also important to consider the limit that arises through accounting for the welfare of these species. It is clear that they feel pain and pleasure just as humans do, so their utility should be taken into consideration in global welfare economics. The economist Bentham, who developed basic utilitarian philosophy using modern economics, presents the argument that the interests of subhuman species have been neglected throughout history. He argues that they should receive a weight greater than 0 for the pleasure and pain they experience. Is it morally wrong to assume the life of a rabbit is worth less than the life of a human? And who's to determine how many rabbits a human life is worth? Prices in our markets estimate the instrumental value of these species, but not their true intrinsic value, which is both underestimated and misrepresented. For these reasons, moral limits on habitat takeover and intrinsic worth of subhuman species creates a limit on economic growth. Collective action is required to preserve subhuman species, just like it is required to preserve the needs of the distant future. The cost to future generations through habitat takeover and consequently extinction is irreversible, just as drawdown is much more serious for renewables than non-renewables. An extra barrel of oil used today represents only a one-time sacrifice by some future generation. Extinction of a gene pool represents a loss to all future generations. Limits from self-canceling effects. The third limit considers the self-canceling effects on desirability of aggregate growth. The Easterlin paradox questions the assumption that traditional economists believe of aggregate economic growth increasing social welfare. The concept explores the idea that in developed countries, individuals with a higher income are more likely to report being happy, which demonstrates a positive correlation. However, the paradox is that their reported happiness was not significantly associated with economic growth. His studies found that rich people often rated themselves as very happy, while the poor rated themselves as not very happy, as we would all expect. However, for different countries with vastly different income levels, the differences in reported happiness was minimal. An additional finding was that for a single country that experienced growth and consequently substantial income increases, there was no rise in self-reported happiness. This reassures the discovery that John Stuart Mill found, that men do not desire to be rich, but to be richer than other men. As everybody's relative income increases at the same rate, aggregate growth is limited by a self-canceling effect on welfare. No one feels better or worse off, so there is a canceling on the intrapersonal level. We can conclude from this that the only way that growth will make someone happier is by making another less happy. So why grow beyond the level where our absolute needs are satisfied? Keene's comment explores an answer to this question. Human needs fall into two classes. The first class being our basic needs, which we have whatever the situation of our fellow human beings, and the second being our relative needs, which makes us feel superior to our fellows. So, once our absolute needs are met, relative needs bring additional satisfaction. A possible solution to this paradox focuses on changes to income levels. Once one's relative income level becomes routine over time, as they face the same budget constraint while managing everyday life, happiness can then be derived from a temporary increase in their income. Satisfaction from work has also been found to be declining while we have experienced economic growth. This demonstrates that the self-canceling factors from growth arising from increasing competition for a number of positional goods. This can be illustrated through the scenario of an audience at a football game who are all brought to their feet by a game-changing play. As everybody stands up to gain a better view of the spectacular play, the result is that no one has any better view than when they were all seated. The same is present in our labor market. Some jobs that required a bachelor's degree now require a master's, and then those required a PhD, and so forth. This upgrading of ourselves demonstrates the same principle as in the football game, where we reap the same benefits we originally experienced, despite our growth. Overall, these self-canceling effects on growth are far less important to welfare than often interpreted. Our goals should be focused on social priorities, where we accurately consider the impact on subhuman species, future generations, and the trade-offs we are making for growth.
Okay, thank you, Nick. Now let's talk about the last concept under ethical social limits, which is the depletion of moral capital as a limit to growth. So the idea presented in the paper is that the forces propelling economic growth are simultaneously eroding the moral foundations of the very social order which give purpose and direction to that growth. So to break it down further, on the demand side of the market, the glorification of self-interest and the pursuit of infinite wants leads to a weakening of moral distinctions between luxury and necessity. Now, moral limits constraining demand for junks are inconvenient in a growth economy because growth increases when junk sells. So the growth economy fosters the erosion of the values upon which it depends, such as honesty, sobriety, trust, etc. On the other side of the market, the supply side, the infinite power of science-based technology is thought to be capable of overcoming all biophysical limits. But even if this erroneous proposition were true, the very worldview of scientism leads to the debunking of any notion of transcendental value and to undercutting the moral basis of the social cohesion pre-proposed by a market society. Now, as the internal moral restraint is eroded, then external police power is needed to be substituted. Now, the latter requires real resources taken from other uses and other good causes to substitute for the depletion of the free public good of moral restraint based on shared values. So, at a minimum, the problem of sustainability requires maintaining intact the moral knowledge or ethical capital inherited from the past. In fact, sustainability really requires an increase in knowledge, both of technique and of purpose, sufficient to offset the inevitable degradation of our physical world. And that marks the end of our presentation on the paper. We hope our presentation and the material presented, it could be of value to everyone in the class. We want to, before we end the presentation, we want to propose two questions. The first question is that the paper was written from 40 years ago, right? A long time ago. Since then, the world has evolved drastically. Do you think that we're approaching biophysical limits and ethical social limits given the knowledge and technology we have today? And the second question is that in what specific way have we been able to achieve a more sustainable present than what was predicted in the paper? So for example, the paper states that the world population will reach 10 billion by 2030, leading to a more crowded, more polluted, and less ecologically stable world than we live in now. However, the current estimate predicts that we will not reach this level until 2050. How have we limited this population growth, in your opinion? And we look forward to see everyone's responses on the forum. Thank you.